The valley had been silent for 30 years. 82 acres of hollow ground swallowed beneath a sea of gray-green reeds, stretching 12 feet high in every direction, so dense that aerial photographs showed nothing beneath them, so thick that the county had spent $18,000 trying to clear them and walked away defeated. Twice. The land sat at the edge of Harlan Creek like something the valley had decided to forget. No road, no access, no visible reason for anyone to care. Then a woman raised her hand in a courthouse basement, and the room went quiet in a different way. She paid $82, the whole thing. Outside, a man in a canvas coat was already waiting. He had a check in his pocket prepared before she ever raised that card. He smiled when he made his offer. He stopped smiling when she refused. Something beneath those reeds was worth fighting over. Neither of them knew yet how right they both were. The auctioneer had a habit of saving the worst for last. Harlan County held its tax delinquency auction every March in the basement of the old courthouse, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of mildew and burnt coffee, where farmers and land speculators sat in folding chairs and pretended not to watch each other. Parcel after parcel moved quickly that morning. A half-acre lot near Clover Road, 17 acres of scrub land off Route 9, a narrow strip of timber ground that 3 men in the back row had clearly come specifically to purchase their eyes, tracking the auctioneer like hounds on a scent. The gavel fell, Rose fell again. Business moved the way it always did in that room, fast practiced without sentiment. Clara Holt sat near the end of the third row and said nothing. She was 60 years old with hands that showed it and eyes that didn't. Her hair had gone silver before 50, and she wore it pulled back the way her mother had pinned at the nape without fuss. She had driven 40 minutes from the farm that morning before full light, stopping once for coffee she didn't finish, and she had arrived early enough to take the seat she wanted, close enough to see the auctioneer's face, far enough from the front that no one would notice her until she needed them to. The room was nearly full. County people. Most of them knew each other the way people know each other in small places, by reputation, first by name, second by what their fathers had done or hadn't done somewhere behind that. Clara recognized a dozen faces without needing to place names to them. A cattle operation out of Caneyville, a timber broker who had been buying logged-out ridgeland for 6 years, 2 young men in clean boots who looked like they'd driven up from Nashville with someone else's money. She did not recognize the man sitting 4 rows ahead of her until he turned to speak to the person beside him. Raymond Stux was 55, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of stillness that belongs to men who have learned that patience is a form of pressure. He wore a canvas work coat that had never seen actual work, and he held a yellow legal pad on his knee with nothing written on it. Clara had seen him twice before, once at a county planning meeting 3 years ago, once at a farm equipment auction where he had bought nothing but watched everything. She knew what he was before she knew his name, the kind of man who arrives early to a room and leaves with more than he came for. Stux did not bid on anything that morning. That was the thing Clara noticed. Every parcel that came through, he sat still. Not uninterested, she could see him tracking the bids, noting prices, his pen touching the legal pad without quite marking it. He was calculating. He was waiting, and the only parcel left was the one everyone in that room had already written off before the auction started. The auctioneer shuffled his papers, found the final listing, and allowed himself a small smile. All right, last one. He paused for effect, or perhaps because he genuinely found it amusing. 82 acres, former Delwood Mill property, Harlan Creek watershed. Delinquent taxes, 4 years outstanding. He looked up. I'll be honest with you, there are easier ways to spend a morning than trying to move this one. Laughter moved through the folding chairs like a small wave. No maintained road access, seasonally inundated, classified as non-recoverable wetland in the last county assessment. He set the paper down. Entire acreage overgrown with Phragmites australis common reed at densities the county extension office described as, and I'm quoting here, among the most impenetrable they have assessed in this region. Another ripple of laughter. Someone in the back said something Clara couldn't catch, which produced more of it. Opening bid is set at $1 per acre. $82 takes the whole thing. The room went quiet the way it does when no one wants to be the first to speak. A full minute passed. The auctioneer looked around without urgency. He had done this before Clara understood left space for someone's curiosity or boredom to become a low bid. because even worthless land occasionally found a buyer if you gave the silence long enough to become uncomfortable. But this land was different. This wasn't scrub land that might be cleared or ridge timber that might be logged. This was 82 acres that the county itself had tried to reclaim twice, both times, abandoning the effort when the reeds returned faster than any equipment could remove them. Everyone in that room knew it. The Delwood Swamp, they called it, though the name on the county maps was something older. Stux had not moved. His pen rested flat against the legal pad. Clara raised her bidder's card. The room turned. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in weight, the heads rotating, the particular quality of attention that comes when something unexpected happens in a familiar place. A man 3 seats to her left actually leaned forward to confirm what he was seeing. The auctioneer looked at her card, then at her face with the expression of someone trying to determine whether this was serious. $82, he said carefully. Do I have any other interest? He did not. 3 strikes of the gavel. The sound echoed off the low ceiling and the concrete floor, and came back changed flatter like an argument that had already been decided. Clara tucked her bidder's card into her jacket pocket. Around her, the room began to stir, people rising, conversations starting, the ordinary noise of a morning's business concluding. She stayed seated another moment, not from hesitation, but from habit. She had learned long ago that moving too quickly out of a room was its own kind of signal. It was in that moment, while the room still shifted around her, that she became aware of Raymond Stux standing at the end of her row. He had moved without her noticing, which she filed away without showing. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, something more measured than that, more considered. He held the legal pad at his side, and Clara noticed that the top sheet was still blank. Mrs. Holt, his voice was even unhurried. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Raymond Stux. I run a land development operation out of Lexington. He extended a hand and she shook it because refusing would have told him something. I'll be direct with you since I suspect you're the kind of person who appreciates that. I'd like to buy that parcel from you. Today, if you're willing, I can write you a check right now for $656, 8 times what you just paid, and we can have this settled before lunch. Clara looked at him without answering immediately. $656 was 8 times 82, which meant he had done that arithmetic in his head while walking across the room. He had been ready with the number before she raised her card. That's a generous offer, she said. I like to open with something fair. He smiled then briefly. Saves time. I'm going to keep the land. She said it without apology, the way she might note the weather. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger exactly, more like recalibration. He studied her for a moment, and she let him. I understand, he said finally. If you change your mind, I'm easy to reach. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the seat beside her. Then he looked at her with an expression she recognized only later, driving home the look of a man who has already decided what happens next and is simply observing the current situation as a preliminary step. I hope the land treats you well, Mrs. Holt. I truly do. He paused. You'll be sorry before spring. He said it pleasantly, the way you'd say the weather might turn, and he walked away before she could respond. Clara picked up the business card. Raymond Stux, Stux Land Holdings, LLC, Lexington, Kentucky. She held it for a moment, then placed it in her jacket pocket beside the bidder's card. Outside, the March morning was pale and cold, the kind of light that shows everything without warming anything. She drove home through country she had known her whole life without really seeing it. The ridge lines, the creek bottoms, the fields still brown from winter. She had absorbed all of this so thoroughly that it had become the background against which she thought rather than a thing she looked at. Her husband Douglas had died 4 years ago in October, and she had kept the cattle operation running since then with Everett's help. Though Everett had his own opinions about how that should go and expressed them with the particular persistence of someone who was right often enough to have developed confidence in the habit. She thought about the land she had just bought. 82 acres. She had never walked it. She had driven the perimeter twice from the county road, and both times she had seen only the wall of reeds stretching away from the road shoulder, like something that had been placed there deliberately, dense gray-green, impenetrable to the eye. The county extension agent had told her when she asked that Phragmites australis, established at that density, could reduce native plant species to near zero within a decade. That the root systems called rhizomes spread horizontally underground at rates that defeated most mechanical removal. that the county had spent $18,000 on two separate attempts to clear sections of that land and had nothing to show for either effort except a bill. What the extension agent had not told her because she had not asked, and he would not have known to mention it, was what lay beneath the reeds. That was the part Clara held inside herself like a question not yet spoken aloud. She turned off the county road onto the gravel drive that led to the farm, and the familiar sound of tires on loose stone settled something in her chest that the courthouse basement had tightened. Everett was waiting. He was 35 and had his father's coloring and his grandmother's stubbornness, and he was standing by the barn door with his arms crossed in a way that meant he had been waiting long enough to develop a position. "How'd it go?" Clara got out of the truck. "I bought the Delwood parcel." Everett was quiet for a moment. "All of it. 82 acres. He looked at the gravel. "Mom, that's every dollar from the equipment sale and most of the—" "I know what it is, Everett." He looked up. He had the sense at least not to say what came next immediately. He let it sit between them for a moment. "That land has been underwater for 30 years. The county couldn't fix it. What are we supposed to do with 82 acres of reeds?" "Not reeds," she said. "Something under the reeds." She walked past him toward the house, and after a moment she heard him follow. Inside, she made coffee. She actually finished this time, and she spread the county survey map she had ordered 3 weeks ago across the kitchen table. The map showed the parcel in the abstract geometry of county documents: boundary lines, elevation, contours, the blue thread of Harlan Creek running along the property's eastern edge before curving away toward the lower valley. It showed the county-designated wetland area covering approximately 60 of the 82 acres. It showed the old road easement that had been abandoned before the map was drawn. It showed in very small notation at the lower corner of the parcel the words "Former Delwood Mill Site." Everett stood across the table and looked at the map for a long time without speaking. "Finally, you knew about the mill." "I knew the name was on the map." "That's not the same as knowing there's anything left." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He sat down. She poured him coffee without asking. For a while, neither of them spoke, and the kitchen held the particular quiet of a place where a decision has already been made, and both people in the room understand that the talking is not about changing it. "I need to understand the water first," Clara said at last. "Before anything else. Before any animals go on that land, I need to know where the water comes from, where it wants to go, how it moves after rain." She tapped the creek line on the map. "Harlan Creek floods that valley from the east, but there are natural springs in the lower section. I've seen them on the aerial photographs. Water doesn't pool like that without sources." She traced a contour line with her finger. "The reeds spread because the drainage channels filled. Not because the land is genuinely wet, because the water has nowhere to go." Everett looked at the map. She could see him working through it, setting aside his objections in favor of the problem itself, which was the thing she had always valued most about him, that he was willing to think even when he disagreed. "And the hogs." She had been thinking about hogs since she was 12 years old. It came back to her the way things learned early come back, not as memory exactly, but as something embedded in the body and the hands. Her father, Harold Voss, had stood beside a fence at the edge of a cattail marsh on their property in Letcher County, watching a small group of heritage hogs work through the dense vegetation with the focused efficiency of creatures who had found something better than anything else in the field. Claire had been beside him wearing her older brother's boots because hers were wet, trying to understand what her father saw in this that made him watch so carefully. "They're making a mess," she had said. Harold shook his head slowly without looking at her. His eyes stayed on the hogs. "No, they're uncovering one." He pointed toward the freshly turned ground behind the animals where the disturbed soil was already beginning to lighten in color to open. "The rhizomes come out whole when a pig roots them. Machine cuts them. Cutting stimulates regrowth. Rooting removes." He watched a moment longer. "A pig never roots where the ground has nothing left to give." She had not fully understood at the time. She had written the sentence in her school notebook because it seemed like the kind of thing her father said that mattered more later than it did now. She was right about that. At a regional conservation conference she attended at 52, a decade into Douglas's illness, and 2 years before he died, she had sat in a back row of a meeting room in Bowling Green and listened to a wetlands ecologist from the university describe exactly what her father had shown her. At 12, the use of heritage breed hogs in rotational paddock systems to remove invasive wetland vegetation without mechanical disturbance to the soil profile, without cutting rhizomes, without compacting the underlying hydrology. The ecologist had slides, research papers, cost-benefit analyses. Her father had had 20 hogs and 40 years of watching. She had written one line across the top of her notes that afternoon. A pig always roots for tomorrow's meal. Sometimes it uncovers yesterday. Standing before 82 acres of gray-green reeds, the memory of that sentence was less like nostalgia and more like instruction. What she did not tell Everett, because there was no point telling him things before she knew them herself, was that she had spent 6 weeks before the auction studying the old aerial photographs of the Delwood parcel that the county assessor's office kept on file. The oldest photographs, taken in 1971, before the reed coverage became total, showed something she had looked at twice before she believed what she was seeing. A faint linear depression running diagonally across the lower section of the parcel, too straight to be natural running at an angle that corresponded to no creek bed or drainage pattern on any current map. It ran from the eastern edge of the parcel, near where Harlan Creek curved away toward the higher ground at the center, and in the 1971 photograph, before the reeds had grown tall enough to cover the slight elevation difference, you could see the depression clearly. A channel. Man-made. She had not said anything about this to anyone, but it was the reason she had raised her bidder's card. 3 days after the auction, she drove to the Delwood parcel for the first time as its owner and walked the perimeter with a notebook, a measuring wheel, and a pair of rubber boots that came to her hip. The reeds began at the road shoulder and extended in every direction, closing overhead in places, reducing visibility to 10 or 15 feet in the denser sections. She did not try to enter them. Instead, she worked the edges, measuring elevations where she could, noting where water had pooled during the recent rain, marking the locations of the natural springs she had identified from the aerial photographs. She was doing this on the second morning, working along the western boundary where the ground was firmer, when she noticed the sign. It was new. Constructed of treated lumber, professionally lettered, planted on a steel post in the ground of the property, directly adjacent to the western boundary of the Delwood parcel. Future site Harlan Creek Commerce Park, a Stucks Land Holdings development. Below the logo in smaller text, Phase 1 Breaking Ground Summer. Clara stood in front of that sign for a long time. She looked at the sign. She looked at the boundary line where her land met his. She looked at the reeds rising beyond the boundary on her side, and at the scraped earth on his side, where someone had already begun preliminary grading. Then she looked back at the sign. Raymond Stucks had purchased the property directly west of the Delwood parcel. He had purchased it, she understood now, not because he wanted it particularly, but because it was the first piece of a larger project, a project that required the Delwood acres to complete. Without her 82 acres, his Commerce Park was a landlocked partial development without Harlan Creek frontage, without the watershed access that made such a project viable, without enough contiguous acreage to meet county commercial zoning minimums. He had not bid at the auction because he had expected to acquire the land afterward from the county at whatever price the county would accept to be rid of a liability. He had arrived at that auction as a formality, and she had walked into his formality and changed it. The words he had said outside the courthouse came back to her with different weight. "You'll be sorry before spring." Not a threat delivered in anger. A statement of intention delivered in perfect calm, the way a man describes the weather when he has already decided to own the sky. She drove back to the farm. Everett was in the equipment barn adjusting the hay tedder, and she did not stop to tell him what she had found. She went directly to the kitchen table and spread the map again, and this time she looked at it differently, not as a landowner studying her property, but as someone who needed to understand the entire board before the next move was made. She called Warren Deloy's office at the county extension 3 days later. Deloy handled wetlands assessments for the agricultural district and had the particular manner of a man who has delivered disappointing news so many times that disappointment has become his default register. She asked him to come look at the land. He agreed in the tone of a man who expected the visit to be brief. He arrived on a Thursday morning in a state vehicle and stood at the road shoulder, looking at the reed wall with his arms crossed. "I know this parcel," he said before she said anything. "County tried to reclaim sections of it in 2009 and again in 2014. Both times the Phragmites came back within 18 months. He looked at her. "You're putting animals on this heritage hogs, rotational paddock system, 12 to 14-day rotation per section." He was quiet for a moment. "I've read about that approach." "Does it work?" The research suggests it can under the right conditions. He looked at the reeds. I'd want to assess the hydrology before I told you the conditions were right here. That's why I called you? He gave her a look that was not quite surprise, but was something close to it. She had the impression he did not often receive calls from landowners who had already anticipated his objections. They walked the boundary together for the better part of 2 hours, and he took notes and she answered his questions, and by the end of it, she could see him working through something internally, setting aside whatever conclusion he had arrived at before he got out of his vehicle. I'll need to run the assessment formally, he said at the end, but I don't see any preliminary indication of a violation risk with what you're describing if the rotation intervals are managed correctly. He paused. You'd want to document everything. Photographs, movement records for the animals. If anyone raises a water quality question, you want paper. Someone will raise it, she said. He looked at her. You expect a complaint? I think the land next door has plans that don't include 82 acres of restored wetland. Deloy looked west toward the adjacent property where the preliminary grading was visible beyond the boundary. He seemed to absorb this. He did not say anything further about it. But when he left, he drove slowly and she watched his vehicle pause at the boundary line for a moment before continuing down the road. The fencing took 12 days. Clara worked it herself with Everett assisting on the corner post, running portable electric fencing in a rotational grid across the accessible sections of the parcel. 6 paddocks of varying size designed around the elevation data. She had mapped each one targeting a section of dense reed coverage. The western paddocks first where the ground was firmest, and the reeds, while tall, were thinner at the base. The work was hard and wet and cold in the early spring mornings, and Everett completed it without complaint, which she took as his way of committing to the project, even though he had not said as much. On a Saturday morning in early April, the trailer arrived from the breeding operation in Bell County. 65 animals, 40 American guinea hogs, dark bristled and compact, with the particular low-slung build that made them effective at sustained rooting. 25 large blacks, heavier and deeper shouldered, better at the thicker rhizome beds. They came down the ramp with the focused energy of animals who had not been in a new space recently, and they entered the first paddock in a rush that slowed almost immediately when the reeds closed around them. Then the snouts went down. Everett watched this for a while from the fence post. I've never seen pigs attack plants. They're not attacking them, Clara said. They're reading them. He didn't answer, but she could see him watching the way the hogs moved through the reed bed, without the randomness of animals grazing, but with something more purposeful, pushing their snouts beneath the mat of dead material at the base of the stems, lifting the rhizomes, pulling them clear of the soil in long, pale segments. Mud flew in arcs. Reed stems toppled in clusters. In the places the hogs had already worked, the ground was broken open. The soil turned and aerated the rhizomes piled in heaps where the animals had discarded them. It looked like destruction. She knew it was not. The morning she drove past the Delwood parcel on the way into town for supplies and saw the construction vehicles on the adjacent property, a grader, a soil compactor, a flatbed carrying steel, she did not stop. She noted it the way she noted weather. In the diner that morning, she heard the talk before anyone directed it at her. 2 tables over, a group of men she recognized from the auction were explaining to a man with a Nashville haircut what she had done. She bought the swamp, the whole thing, 82 acres. Dale Harper's voice carried without effort. Putting hogs on it. Someone else. In that mess, you'll lose a hog a week in there. Laughter. Clara carried her coffee to the counter and paid without looking over. The owner, a woman named Bess, who had been running the place since the previous century, slid her change across the counter without comment, which was the closest thing to solidarity on offer. Outside, Clara sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. She was not embarrassed. What she felt was something she had no word for, the particular weight of a commitment made in full knowledge of how it looks to everyone watching. Douglas had always told her she had the rare quality of not needing to explain herself. He had meant it as a compliment, and she had received it that way, but she understood now it also meant carrying things alone that other people shared. She started the truck. She had fencing wire to pick up and a second waterer to install in the east paddock, and she needed to call Gideon Marsh at the Historical Society about the old plat maps she had requested. There was too much to do for sitting still. The call from the county came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the hogs went in. A formal letter arrived the same afternoon, certified mail, which she signed for at the road. It was from the Harlan County Environmental Compliance Office, referencing a complaint filed by an adjacent property owner alleging improper management of livestock waste on a wetland-adjacent parcel, potential contamination of the Harlan Creek watershed. The letter informed her that an assessment had been initiated. Warren Deloy would conduct the evaluation. She was required to maintain access for the assessment team and to produce documentation of her livestock management practices within 10 days. She read it twice, then she called Deloy's office. His assistant said he was in the field. Clara left her name. She did not leave a message because the message she needed to leave was not the kind that could be shortened. Deloy called back that evening. "I've seen the complaint." His voice was careful. "Mrs. Holt, I want to be straightforward with you. I'm required to conduct this assessment regardless of my preliminary observations. That process will take approximately 3 weeks. I understand. During that time, you're not required to halt operations unless the initial site visit reveals an immediate hazard. I'll be there Friday morning, 8 o'clock. I'll have the documentation ready." There was a pause. "You already have documentation." "I've kept records since the animals went in. Daily rotation logs, water testing at the creek access point, photographs of each paddock before and after entry." Another pause longer. "That's thorough. Someone told me I'd want paper." He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly, not toward warmth exactly, but toward something more direct. "Whoever filed this complaint, Mrs. Holt, they filed it the same day you completed the second paddock rotation. The timing is not accidental." "No," she said, "it isn't." After she hung up, she stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at the map on the table. Still there from weeks ago, its edges slightly curled now from humidity. The notation in the lower corner, the one she had looked at 100 times, former Delwood Mill site. She thought about what Raymond Stucks had said in the courthouse basement. She thought about the blank legal pad and the business card placed deliberately beside her on the chair. She thought about the sign on the adjacent property, the grader running the soil compactor, raising a fine dust that drifted across the boundary line onto her reeds. She thought about her father standing at the fence watching the hogs work. "They're uncovering one," he had said. She turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the April night was clear and cold, the creek audible somewhere below the field, moving the way it always moved without permission, without announcement, following the ground's oldest instructions. 8 weeks ago, that land had been a courthouse joke. Now Raymond Stucks had filed a formal complaint with the county to stop what she was doing before it went further. That told her something important. Men who are confident they have already won do not file complaints. They wait. Part 1. Word count 3,847. That came in significantly short. Let me deliver the full version now. The auctioneer had a habit of saving the worst for last. Harlan County held its tax delinquency auction every March in the basement of the old courthouse, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of mildew and burnt coffee, where farmers and land speculators sat in folding chairs and pretended not to watch each other. Parcel after parcel moved quickly that morning. A half-acre lot near Clover Road, 17 acres of scrub land off Route 9, a narrow strip of timber ground that 3 men in the back row had clearly come specifically to purchase their eyes, tracking the auctioneer like hounds on a scent. The gavel fell, Rose fell again. Business moved the way it always did in that room, fast practiced without sentiment. Clara Holt sat near the end of the third row and said nothing. She was 60 years old with hands that showed it and eyes that didn't. Her hair had gone silver before 50, and she wore it pulled back, pinned at the nape without fuss. She had driven 40 minutes from the farm before full light stopping once for coffee. She didn't finish arriving early enough to take the seat. She wanted close enough to see the auctioneer's face, far enough from the front that no one would notice her until she needed them to. She had a bidder's card in her jacket pocket that she had registered under her own name, which was not something she'd hidden, but not something she'd announced either. The room was nearly full. County people mostly. Men who knew each other the way people know each other in small places by reputation, first by name, second by what their fathers had done or failed to do somewhere in the background. Clara recognized a dozen faces without needing to match names to them. A cattle operation out of Caneyville. A timber broker who had been buying logged-out ridge land for 6 consecutive years. 2 young men in clean boots who looked like they'd driven up from Nashville with someone else's money in someone else's confidence about what things were worth in Harlan County. She did not recognize the man sitting 4 rows ahead of her until he turned to speak to the person beside him. Raymond Stux was 55, broad through the shoulders, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have learned that patience is a form of pressure. He wore a canvas work coat that had never seen actual work and held a yellow legal pad on his knee with nothing written on it. Clara had seen him twice before, once at a county planning meeting 3 years ago, where he had said very little and listened carefully to everything, once at a farm equipment sale, where he had bid on nothing but cataloged the room with his eyes the entire morning. She understood what he was before she placed his name, the kind of man who arrives early to rooms and leaves with more than he came in with. Stux did not bid on anything that morning. That was what Clara noticed. Every parcel that came forward, he sat motionless. Not disinterested, she could see him tracking the bids, marking something internal, his pen touching the legal pad without quite marking it. He was calculating, he was waiting. The only parcel remaining was the one everyone in that room had written off before the auction began. The auctioneer shuffled his papers, found the final listing, allowed himself a small smile. All right, last one. A pause for effect, or perhaps because he genuinely found something in it. 82 acres. Former Delwood Mill property, Harlan Creek watershed. Delinquent taxes, 4 years outstanding. He looked up. I'll be candid, there are easier ways to spend a Tuesday morning than moving this one. Laughter rolled through the folding chairs. No maintained road access. Seasonally inundated. Classified as non-recoverable wetland in the last county assessment. He set the paper down. Entire acreage overgrown with Phragmites australis common reed at densities the county extension office described as, and I'm quoting directly, among the most impenetrable in their assessment history. More laughter. Someone in the back called out something Clara couldn't catch, which produced still more of it. Opening bid is set at $1 per acre. $82 takes it all. The room went quiet the way it does when no one wants to be the first. A full minute passed. The auctioneer waited without urgency, giving the silence room to make someone uncomfortable enough to speak. This was technique Clara recognized, letting the absence of bidders become its own kind of pressure, because even genuinely unwanted land occasionally finds a buyer if you let the quiet grow heavy enough. But this was different. This wasn't scrub land that might eventually be cleared or ridged timber that could be logged for salvage value. This was 82 acres the county itself had tried to reclaim, twice walking away from the effort, both times when the reeds returned faster than any machinery could remove them. The Delwood Swamp, everyone called it. The name on the county maps was older, and that was the name Clara had been thinking about since October. Stux had not moved. His pen rested flat on the legal pad. Clara raised her bidder's card. The room turned. She felt it before she saw it, the shift of weight, the heads rotating, the specific quality of attention that arrives when something unexpected happens in a familiar place. A man 3 seats to her left actually leaned forward to confirm what he was seeing. The auctioneer looked at her card, then at her face, with the expression of a man assessing sincerity. $82, he said carefully. Do I have any other interest? He did not. 3 strikes of the gavel. The sound hit the concrete floor and came back changed flatter. Clara tucked the bidder's card into her jacket pocket. Around her, the room began to reassemble itself. People rising, conversations starting up, the ordinary noise of concluded business. She stayed seated another moment, not from hesitation, but from habit. She had learned long ago that moving too quickly out of a room was its own kind of statement. Raymond Stux was standing at the end of her row before she stood. He had moved without her noticing, which she filed without showing it. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, something more measured, more deliberate. His legal pad was at his side, the top sheet still blank. Mrs. Holt. His voice was even and unhurried. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Raymond Stux. Land development based out of Lexington. He extended a hand. She shook it because refusing would have given him information. I'll be direct with you since I suspect you appreciate that. I'd like to purchase that parcel. Today, if you're willing. I can write you a check right now for $656. That's 8 times your purchase price, and we can settle this before noon. Clara looked at him without answering immediately. $656 was 8 times 82, which meant he had done the arithmetic in his head while crossing the room. He had the number prepared before she raised the card. "That's a generous offer," she said. "I try to open with something fair. Saves time. I'm going to keep the land." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, something more like recalibration. The adjustment of a plan, encountering an obstacle it had not assigned sufficient probability. He studied her for a moment, and she let him. "I understand," he said in a tone that meant he understood something different than she meant. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the seat beside her with the deliberateness of someone completing a formality. Then he looked at her one more time. "I hope the land is good to you, Mrs. Holt." "I truly do." A pause measured and weightless. "You'll be sorry before spring." He said it the way you'd observe that rain was coming, not as threat, but as weather report, and he walked away before she could answer. Clara picked up the card. Raymond Stucks, Stucks Land Holdings, LLC, Lexington, Kentucky. She held it a moment, placed it beside the bidder's card in her pocket, walked out of the courthouse into the pale March morning. She had grown up in Letcher County, 20 miles east. Her father, Harold Voss, had farmed bottomland and raised heritage hogs on land that most people in the county had considered marginal, too wet in spring, too rocky in the upper sections, not particularly suited to anything that required consistent output. Harold had seen it differently. He had the quality rare in her experience of looking at land that disappointed other people and finding in the disappointment a kind of information about what the land was actually suited for, as opposed to what someone had hoped it would be. She had been 12 years old the morning she stood beside him at the fence of the lower pasture, watching a small group of the heritage hogs work through a section of cattails and dense wetland growth along the spring-fed pond. The animals moved with a focused efficiency that looked to a 12-year-old like chaos snouts driving into the mat of vegetation mud, arcing stems toppling. "They're making a mess," she had said. Harold shook his head without looking at her. His eyes stayed on the hogs. "No, they're uncovering one." He pointed toward the disturbed ground behind the animals, where the open soil was already beginning to show a different color. "The rhizomes come out whole when a pig roots them. A machine cuts, cutting stimulates, rooting removes." He was quiet for a moment. A pig never roots where the ground has nothing left to give. She had written that sentence in her school notebook because it had the quality of things her father said that mattered more later than they did in the moment. She was right about that. 4 decades later, at a conservation conference in Bowling Green, she had sat in the back row of a meeting room and listened to a university wetlands ecologist describe with research slides and published papers and cost-benefit modeling precisely what her father had shown her at the pond. Heritage breed hogs in rotational paddock systems. Rhizome removal without mechanical soil disturbance. Native plant seed banks that survived beneath invasive coverage for decades waiting for an opening. The ecologist had peer-reviewed citations. Harold Voss had had 20 hogs and a fence. She had written one line across the top of her conference notes: "A pig always roots for tomorrow's meal. Sometimes it uncovers yesterday." Standing before 82 acres of gray-green reeds the first time she walked the perimeter alone, that sentence came back not as memory, but as instruction. What she had not told Everett, had not told anyone, was the thing she had seen in the county assessor's aerial photograph archive 6 weeks before the auction. The assessor's office kept photographs going back to the 1960s, useful for tracking property development and drainage changes over time, not typically of interest to the general public. Clara had requested the full archive for the Delwood parcel on a Thursday in January, telling the clerk she was researching a land purchase, which was true. She had sat in the assessor's conference room for 2 hours, going through the photographs in sequence. The 1971 photograph was the one. Taken before the reed coverage had grown tall enough to fully obscure the surface, it showed something she had to look at twice before she trusted it. A faint linear depression running diagonally across the lower portion of the parcel, too straight by a significant margin to be any natural drainage feature. It ran at an angle corresponding to no creek bed, no recorded drainage channel, no topographic explanation on any current map. It ran from the eastern boundary near the point where Harlan Creek bent away from the property toward the elevated center ground, and in the 1971 photograph, before the reeds obscured the slight grade differential, the depression was unmistakable. A channel, made by people. She had not said anything about this to anyone. It was the reason she had raised the bidder's card. 3 days after the auction, she drove out to the Delwood parcel for the first time as its owner and walked the boundary with rubber boots, a notebook, a measuring wheel, and the particular focus of someone who is confirming what she already suspects, rather than discovering what she doesn't know. The reeds began at the road shoulder and extended in every direction, closing overhead in the denser sections, reducing visibility to 10 or 15 feet, dense enough that she could hear the wind moving the upper stems, while the air at ground level was entirely still. She did not enter the interior. She worked the edges, measuring elevations, noting where the recent rain had pooled, marking the approximate locations of the springs she had identified from the aerials. She was on the second morning's walk, working the western boundary where the ground was firmer, when she saw the sign. New construction lumber, professional lettering, steel posts driven into the ground of the property directly adjacent to her western boundary line. Future site, Harlan Creek Commerce Park, a Stux Land Holdings development. Below the logo in smaller text, Phase 1 Breaking Ground Summer. Clara stood in front of that sign without moving for a long time. She looked at the sign. She looked at the boundary line between her property and the one carrying it. She looked at the reeds on her side, the scraped earth on his, where preliminary grading had already begun cutting the topsoil into neat parallel lines that ran to within 20 feet of her boundary. Then she looked at the sign again. Raymond Stux had purchased the property west of the Delwood parcel. He had purchased it not because that parcel was particularly valuable on its own. The ground was thin, the slope awkward, the road access mediocre, but because it was the first piece of something larger. A commercial development along Harlan Creek needed creek frontage. It needed watershed access. It needed enough contiguous acreage to meet county commercial zoning minimums for that classification. Without the Delwood acres, his Commerce Park was landlocked, undersized, lacking the creek frontage that made the project financially viable. Without her 82 acres, nothing Stux had purchased was worth what he had paid for it. He had not bid at the auction because he had expected to acquire the land afterward. From the county, at whatever price the county would accept to be relieved of a parcel that generated no tax revenue and cost money every few years in failed reclamation attempts. He had walked into that courthouse as a formality, and she had walked into his formality and bought what he needed. The words from the courthouse corridor returned with different weight. You'll be sorry before spring. Not anger, not even a threat exactly. A schedule. She drove back to the farm and said nothing to Everett until that evening when she told him what she had found. He listened without interrupting, which meant he understood the seriousness. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. So he needed that land for his project. He still needs it. Everett looked at the table, and he's not the kind of person who just accepts that he can't have it. No, Clara said. He's not. The fencing went in over 12 days, Clara and Everett working the corner posts in the cold April mornings, running portable electric fencing across the accessible sections of the parcel in a rotational grid, 6 paddocks of varying size, arranged around the elevation data she had mapped, each targeting a section of dense reed coverage. The western paddocks first where the ground was firmest. The work was wet and cold and required attention to terrain that shifted unpredictably under the reed mat, and they completed it without incident, except for one afternoon when Everett pulled a corner post from ground that turned out to be a subsurface spring pocket, and they both went past the knee in standing water before they found stable footing. He said nothing about this, which she appreciated. The animals arrived on a Saturday in early April from a breeding operation in Bell County that she had arranged the previous autumn. 65 animals down the ramp, 40 American guinea hogs, dark-bristled, low-slung, built for sustained rooting work in dense vegetation. 25 large blacks, heavier and deeper-shouldered, effective against the thicker rhizome beds. They entered the first paddock in a rush that slowed almost immediately when the reeds closed around them. Then the snouts went down. Everett stood at the fence watching. I've never seen pigs attack plants like that. Clara kept her eyes on the hogs. They're not attacking, they're reading. In the diner the following Saturday, she heard the conversation before anyone directed it at her. 2 tables over men she recognized from the auction explained the situation to someone she didn't recognize. She bought the swamp, the whole 82 acres. Somebody else, and she's putting hogs on it. In that mess. More laughter. Clara paid at the counter and walked out into the April morning without looking back. She was sitting in the truck when she understood something she had been arranging around the edges of for 3 weeks. Raymond Stux had not been surprised by her decision to keep the land. He had recalibrated, adjusted, and was already moving to a different approach. Men who believed they had time were patient. Men who believed they were running out of it filed paperwork. The certified letter from the Harlan County Environmental Compliance Office arrived on a Tuesday in the fourth week after the animals went in. Formal complaint. Adjacent property owner. Alleged improper management of livestock waste on a wetland-adjacent parcel. Potential contamination risk to the Harlan Creek watershed. Assessment initiated. Warren Deloy County Wetlands Specialist assigned to evaluate. She read the letter at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. The complaint had been filed, she noted, from the date 2 days after Everett had sent her a photograph of the first paddock post-rotation, the one showing the native sedges beginning to emerge from the open ground. She had sent that photograph to the county extension office as part of her routine documentation because Warren Deloy had told her to keep paper. Stux had someone watching, or he had someone inside. She called Deloy's office. His assistant said he was in the field. She left her name. He called back that evening, and his voice carried the care of a man navigating a situation he hadn't chosen. He explained the assessment process, the timeline, her rights during the evaluation period. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him she had daily rotation logs, water testing records at the creek access point, and dated photographs of every paddock before and after each rotation cycle. His response was a pause long enough to tell her something. "That's thorough, Mrs. Holt. Someone told me I'd want paper. They were right." Another pause. "The complaint was filed by an adjacent property owner. I can't tell you more than that, and I suspect I don't need to." He cleared his throat. "Friday at 8, I'll bring the assessment forms." After she hung up, Clara sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on the additional light. The map was still on the table, its edges curled from weeks of use, the notation in the lower corner, visible even from a distance, former Delwood Mill site. Stux had filed the complaint because the hogs were working, not in spite of what she was doing because of it. He had watched the first paddock rotation succeed, had seen the native vegetation returning, had understood that if she continued, the land would begin to demonstrate exactly what she believed it could become. And a recovered wetland with documented ecological value was significantly harder to acquire through pressure than a swamp that everyone agreed was worthless. She thought about the 1971 aerial photograph. The straight depression cutting diagonally across the lower section of the parcel, too deliberate to be natural. Nobody had asked about it in the assessor's office when she had pulled those files. Nobody had thought to look at what the Delwood land had been before it became the Delwood Swamp. Stux was trying to stop her before she found out. Outside, the April night carried the sound of Harlan Creek moving through the lower field water, following its oldest instructions, indifferent to whoever owned the land it crossed. In the first paddock, 65 animals were resting in the mud they had made among the rhizomes they had pulled on, ground that had not seen open sky in 30 years. Spring had not yet arrived, but the reeds were already beginning to fall. Warren Deloy arrived Friday morning at 8 o'clock exactly, which told Clara something about him, that he was the kind of man who treated punctuality as a form of honesty. He came in the state vehicle parked on the road, shoulder walked to where she was standing without preliminaries. He carried a clipboard, a water testing kit, and the expression of someone who had already composed a version of this visit in his head and was now adjusting it against the reality in front of him. The first paddock had been closed for 9 days. The hogs had moved to the second section the previous week, and what they left behind in paddock 1 was something that stopped Deloy at the fence line without him appearing to notice he had stopped. The reed mat was gone. Not thinned, gone. In its place, the soil lay broken and turned rhizome piles drying at the edges, and across the open ground, something thin and green had pushed through in the days since the animals moved out. Sedges. Soft rush. In the corner nearest the fence, 3 stalks of blue flag iris stood in the early morning light with the improbable authority of things that had been waiting a long time for exactly this opportunity. Deloy crouched at the fence line and looked at the iris for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at the soil profile where the rhizomes had been pulled, the way the hog disturbance had opened the ground without compacting the deeper layers. Clara watched him work through it, the recognition arriving in stages, each one slightly rearranging whatever conclusion he had driven out here prepared to write. He stood. How long since the animals left this section? 9 days. He looked at the iris. The seed bank survived intact. His voice had lost the careful neutrality it carried when he arrived. I've seen paddock restoration projects that took 3 growing seasons to get native sedge reestablishment. You have iris in 9 days. He turned to her. The rhizome removal was complete enough that the invasive root system isn't competing for the light opening. That's what the rotation interval is designed to do, Clara said. Long enough for regrowth to be assessed. Short enough that the hogs return before the phragmites can reestablish from any root fragments they missed. He made a note. Then he walked the full paddock perimeter, took 3 water samples at the drainage point nearest Harlan Creek, photographed the soil disturbance pattern, photographed the emerging vegetation. Clara walked with him and said nothing unless he asked a question, which he did 3 times. Each question was specific, technical, the kind that came from someone who was now genuinely curious rather than conducting a required process. At the end of it, standing at the gate of the second paddock, where the hogs were audibly working somewhere in the reed interior, Deloy looked at his clipboard. I'll submit my assessment within the week. Based on what I've observed this morning, I'm not finding evidence of the contamination risk described in the complaint. He paused. The water samples will confirm, but the drainage pattern here actually moves away from the creek, not toward it. Whoever filed this complaint either didn't know the hydrology or didn't care about it. Clara said nothing. Deloy looked at the adjacent property's grading visible beyond the western boundary. The soil compactor idle this morning, but the tracks fresh. Mrs. Holt, I'm going to ask you something outside the scope of this assessment, and you don't have to answer. He kept his eyes on the grading. Do you know what was here before the phragmites took over? I have a theory. Based on what? A county aerial photograph from 1971. There's a linear depression in the lower section, too straight for natural drainage. She watched his face. I've requested the old plat maps from the Historical Society. Deloy absorbed this. If there's significant historical infrastructure under that reed coverage, he stopped. That would change the land's status considerably. Yes, Clara said. It would. He left before 9. Clara watched the state vehicle until it disappeared around the bend, then turned back to the second paddock. Inside the reed wall, a large black was working a particularly dense section near the eastern fence, and she could track its progress by the sound, the rhythmic grunt and heave of an animal that had found something worth the effort. She had learned in the 6 weeks since the animals arrived to read the herd by its sounds, the way her father had read weather by the way light fell across the ridge. The focused, sustained rooting meant deep rhizomes. The faster, more scattered noise meant a rhizome bed already partially broken up, the work becoming easier. She went back to the farm to call Gideon Marsh. Gideon was 68 years old and had been the Harlan County Historical Society's primary archivist since before Clara had left for college. He was the kind of scholar who existed in a particular relationship with county records, not merely familiar with them, but intimate the way a person becomes intimate with a landscape they have walked daily for decades. He knew where things were filed that were not filed where they should be. He knew which deed books had been incorrectly cataloged in the 1940s reorganization. He knew from memory which plat maps existed for which parcels in which decades because he had handled them all. Clara had called him 3 weeks ago to request the 1889 plat documentation for the Delwood parcel. He had told her in the mild tone he used for everything that he would look into it. This meant he was already looking. His voice when he answered carried the particular quality of a man who has found something and has been waiting for permission to discuss it. Mrs. Holt, I was going to call you this afternoon. What did you find? A pause, not hesitation, more like a man arranging what he wants to say into the right order. I found the 1889 plat map. I also found the corresponding deed record, the original mill licensing documentation from the County Water Rights Registry, and something I wasn't looking for. Another pause, more deliberate. A survey drawing, detailed, signed by the original mill engineer. His voice shifted slightly. Mrs. Holt, the Delwood mill operation was more substantial than the county records suggest. The standard historical notation lists it as a grist mill. That's accurate, but incomplete. Clara sat down at the kitchen table. What else was there? The survey drawing shows 3 structures. The grist mill at the creek access point, a sawmill operation on the elevated section separate building connected to the same water system, a blacksmith shop smaller on the northwestern edge, also water-powered via the mill race extension. He let that settle. 3 structures, One water supply system. The mill race, the channel that diverted water from Harlan Creek to power the wheel, ran approximately 500 feet through the lower section of the parcel. Clara looked at the map on the table. The linear depression in the 1971 aerial. 500 feet diagonal, exactly where she had seen it. When can I see the documents? Come tomorrow, Gideon said. I'll have everything laid out. She did not sleep well that night. Not from anxiety, but from the particular restlessness that comes when a theory you have carried alone for months suddenly acquires the weight of documented fact, and you cannot yet do anything with it except hold it in the dark. The assessment report from Warren Deloy arrived by county mail 8 days later. She read it at the kitchen table while Everett stood at the counter. The conclusion was unambiguous. No evidence of water quality contamination, livestock management practices, consistent with conservation standards, native vegetation recovery, observed in restored paddock exceeding projected baseline. The complaint in the language of county assessments was found to be without substantiated basis. The operation could continue without restriction. Everett set his coffee down. So it's over. Clara looked at the report. The complaint is over. He understood the difference. He didn't say anything further. The visit to Gideon's office confirmed everything she had suspected and added dimensions she hadn't. The survey drawing was on drafting paper hand-lettered in the methodical script of 19th century technical documents, each structure precisely located relative to the creek in the mill race. Gideon had unrolled it on the wide sorting table in the archive room and stood back to let her look. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. The mill race was drawn in detail, every curve, every grade, changed the intake structure at the creek, the distribution point where the water divided to serve the wheel. 520 feet of artificial channel, hand-dug stone-lined, engineered to maintain consistent flow across a grade differential of 11 feet over the full length. Beside the channel, the grist mill. Farther up the slope, the sawmill connected via a secondary race extension. At the northwest corner, the blacksmith shop smaller its forge position to use the water wheel's overflow as cooling water. The family that built this, Gideon said, standing beside her, had more engineering knowledge than the historical record gives them credit for. The water distribution system is sophisticated. Everything ran from one source. He pointed to the intake structure at the creek. If the mill race is still intact underground, if the stone lining survived, the hydrology is still there. The channel would still function. Clara straightened. It would still carry water. That's a significant if, Gideon said. 150 years of sediment accumulation route, penetration freeze-thaw cycles. He looked at the drawing, but stone-lined channels have survived longer than that in this region. The question is whether the surface damage penetrated deep enough to compromise the lining. She rolled the survey drawing carefully. Can I take a copy of this? I made you 3. On the drive back, she passed the Delwood parcel without stopping. The third paddock was running and she could see where the reed wall had receded another section, the hogs visible as dark shapes moving steadily through the remaining dense coverage. 6 weeks and nearly 30 acres cleared. The western paddock showed the most advanced recovery. The ground that the first animals had worked in April was now covered in a mat of native growth, thick enough to see from the road. Where there had been nothing but the gray-green monotony of invasive reeds, there was texture now, color, the particular visual complexity of a plant community reassembling itself. She did not see the truck parked on the road's shoulder until she was almost past it. A white pickup, current model. She didn't recognize it, but she recognized the man standing beside it looking over the fence at the recovering paddocks. She pulled over and got out. The man turned. He was not anyone she knew, but he wore the look of someone with a clipboard and a county vehicle, except this was a private truck, which made the clipboard more interesting. He smiled in the way of someone caught doing something he'd prefer to frame as innocent. Morning. Beautiful recovery going on here. It is, Clara said. Can I help you? Just admiring the work. He glanced at the clipboard, then at her. You're the owner, Clara Holt. He nodded without offering his name, which told her what she needed to know. He was making notes. She could see the page from where she stood, a rough sketch of the paddock layout number she couldn't read. Someone hired you to look at this property, she asked. The smile held, passing through. The road dead ends half a mile up, Clara said pleasantly. Has since 1987. He put the clipboard under his arm. I'll let you get on with your morning. He got into the truck, turned around in the narrow road with several point efficiency that suggested he had done it before drove south. She watched until he was gone, memorized the plate number, wrote it in her notebook when she got back in her vehicle. Stux was having the property watched. That was acceptable, the road was public. What it meant was that the Commerce Park project was still live, still being developed, still waiting for a version of events in which she was not there. The complaint had failed. He was gathering information for whatever came next. What came next arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks later, in a form she hadn't anticipated. The day began ordinarily enough. She and Everett worked the fourth paddock fence adjustment in the morning. The ground elevation shifted in the northeastern section, requiring the paddock boundary to be moved to keep the animals on the productive rhizome beds. The hogs went in at midday. By early afternoon, she was at the creek edge taking the routine water samples when Everett called from the far end of the paddock, his voice carrying a note she recognized as the register between curiosity and urgency. She found him crouching in the section the hogs had cleared 2 days prior, where the disturbed soil had already begun to surface dry. He was brushing loose material away from something with his hand, the kind of careful movement you use when you don't know what you're uncovering. Clara crouched beside him. A line of stones. Not loose stones, not the random subsurface rock that appeared everywhere in this valley. These were cut, rectangular, fitted together with the precise intimacy of deliberate construction, one against the next, in a line that ran diagonally across the cleared ground at an angle she recognized immediately because she had been looking at that angle in a photocopy of an 1889 survey drawing for 3 weeks. The mill race. She stood slowly. The line of stones ran in both directions from where they crouched east toward the creek, west toward where the center of the old property would have been. She walked the exposed section counting stones, 14 visible. The line continued under the thin layer of mud and root material that hadn't been fully disturbed yet. It was intact. Everett stood beside her. "What is it?" Clara looked at the diagonal line of cut limestone running through the open ground. "Water used to flow here." She looked toward the creek. "Still might." They marked the location with fence stakes and called Gideon Marsh that evening. He arrived the following morning with his copies of the survey drawing and the expression of a man walking towards something he has spent professional decades hoping to find. He stood at the stone line for a full minute before he spoke. "This is the intake section." He oriented the survey drawing against the landscape, comparing angles. "The line should continue approximately 300 more feet toward the northwest before it reaches the original wheel position." He traced the line's projection through the remaining reed sections. "It's going to run right through the paddocks you haven't opened yet." This was twist 3, though Clara did not call it that. It was simply the confirmation of what the ground had been holding since before anyone living could remember. Within the week, Gideon had contacted the County Historical Preservation Office and a structural engineer who specialized in historic mill sites. The engineer, a methodical man named Coates, who arrived in a vehicle crowded with measuring equipment, spent 4 hours on the exposed stone section before delivering his preliminary assessment with the careful language of someone who has learned not to promise more than the evidence supports. The stone lining showed no structural failure in the exposed section. The mortar was original, a lime-based mix that had counterintuitively been protected from the weathering that destroys modern Portland cement by the very anaerobic conditions created by the reed coverage and standing water. The channel might be largely intact. The only way to know was to open the remaining sections. The hogs were already working toward them. It was during this period, the 4th week after the mill race discovery, the 8th week after the animals arrived, that Raymond Stux made his second approach. She was alone at the eastern fence line when the black SUV pulled onto the shoulder. Stux got out without hurrying, walked to the fence with his hands in his coat pockets, looked at the recovering paddocks in the particular way of someone recalculating a position. The reed coverage was now reduced to roughly 30 acres at the northern end of the parcel. Everywhere else, native growth covered the ground in various stages of recovery, from the thick established mat of the first paddocks to the fresh bare earth of the most recently cleared sections. "I'll be direct," he said in exactly the same tone he had used in the courthouse corridor. "I understand you found some historical structures on the property." He looked at the exposed stone line visible from where they stood. "That complicates things for both of us." Clara kept her hands on the fence rail. "How does it complicate things for me?" "Historical designation processes take time. They cost money. They involve entities with competing interests in how the land is used." He looked at her. I'm prepared to offer you $40,000 for the parcel as it currently stands. That's your investment returned 400 times over, plus enough to replace your equipment barn and your north fence line. He said this as a man who has done research. He knew about the barn, which meant he'd looked at her property records. You walk away whole, better than whole. $40,000. She looked at the recovered paddocks and thought about what they had cost her in money and time, in the particular exhaustion of sustained effort against sustained opposition. She thought about what Gideon had said about the survey drawing. 3 structures, 520 feet of intact stone channel, a water system that had served an entire farming community for 3 decades before the floods came and the family left. No, she said. Stux looked at her for a long moment. The recalculation behind his eyes was visible, this time less controlled than in the courthouse, because this was no longer a preliminary encounter. Mrs. Holt, I want to be honest with you about something. I have the resources to make the next phase of this complicated. He was not threatening precisely. He was describing terrain. Property line disputes, water rights challenges. The county has outstanding questions about the road access easement on the northern boundary that my attorneys believe have not been fully resolved. He paused. These things take years. They cost money you would be spending instead of earning. Clara looked at him. In her experience, men who listed their weapons before using them were men who were not entirely certain the weapons would work. Then I suppose we'll both be busy, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable for either of them. Then he got in the SUV and drove away. She stood at the fence after he left, looking at the paddocks in the afternoon light. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallow pool that had formed in the corner of the first paddock. She had first seen it 2 weeks ago, and now it appeared most mornings. The native sedges were knee-high in the earliest restored sections. Wood ducks had been nesting along the quiet pools for 10 days. The land was doing what she had believed it would do, and every acre that recovered made it harder for anyone to characterize the property as a wetland liability. But Stux was not wrong that he had tools remaining. She had been watching the County Planning Commission agendas in his Commerce Park application, had moved through 2 preliminary approvals without public comment, which meant no one outside the commission had known it was being considered. If the road easement question was real, even a partially meritorious challenge could put a lien on the property title that would prevent her from securing any additional financing. She was already stretched thin. The lawsuit filing fees alone, if he moved on the water rights claim, could consume what remained of the equipment sale proceeds. That night she could not make the numbers work no matter how she arranged them. The land was recovering. The mill race was real. Gideon was documenting everything. But documentation required time, designation required a formal application process, and both required her to still own the land when they concluded. She sat at the kitchen table past midnight with the survey drawing and her bank statements and the certified mail from the compliance office that she had kept in a folder. Everett had gone to bed at 10 after looking at the same numbers and offering one more time the suggestion about selling the north acreage. She had sent him to bed without answering. Outside it was raining. She could hear it in the gutters on the barn roof and the particular percussion it made on the cold ground of a spring that had not yet fully committed to warmth. Somewhere below the farm, Harlan Creek was rising, carrying whatever the valley's ridgelines were shedding tonight out through the lower watershed. She thought about what her father had said, not the sentence about pigs, but the other one said at a different time about a different problem. He had been talking about a fence dispute with a neighbor, a boundary question that had seemed at 14 like the most permanent crisis imaginable. He had been quiet for a long time before he said it. The land outlasts the argument. Your job is to outlast the person making it. She looked at her bank statements. Then she looked at the survey drawing. Then she went to bed because there was nothing more to be done with numbers in the middle of the night, but the morning was going to arrive regardless. The morning it arrived was a Thursday in late September. The night before had been cold, the first real cold of the season, and when Clara walked the property at first light, the ground had a quality she associated with autumn firmer underfoot, the vegetation carrying a different smell, the light arriving lower and staying lower. The hogs had been in the final paddock for 5 days. The paddock covered the northeastern section of the parcel, the last significant area of dense reed coverage, and the animals had been working steadily through a rhizome bed that proved deeper than anything they had encountered in the earlier sections. Everett had arrived before her walking the fence line, and she found him standing on a slight rise at the northern end of the paddock, where the ground lifted 4 feet before dropping again into the final reed bed. He was not looking at the reeds. He was looking at something beyond them in the section the hogs had worked through overnight. She climbed the rise beside him. Something rectangular stood above the mudline at the far edge of the clear ground. Not stone, she would have recognized the gray-white of limestone immediately. Not reed stems, too solid, too dark, the wrong texture entirely. The morning light caught it at an angle that made its surface legible. Weathered timber hand-hewn the surfaces, showing the particular gray of wood that has been sealed from air by mud and anaerobic soil for a very long time. They went down together without speaking. The hogs had rooted through the surface material that covered this section and pulled the rhizomes clear, but the deepest disturbance was only 8 to 10 inches enough to expose what lay immediately below the mat of old reed roots, an accumulated organic debris not enough to disturb the structure itself. Clara crouched and began clearing loose material from the nearest timber with her hands. The wood was dense, harder than it should have been, preserved by the same anaerobic conditions that Coates had described when he examined the mill race mortar. Beneath the first timber, a second. Beneath the second, a third. A floor structure. Heavy hand-hewn, fitted at the joints with wooden pegs the diameter of her thumb. She stood and looked at what the clear ground was showing her. The floor timbers ran on a north-south axis. To the east of them, partially obscured by the mud that the hogs hadn't disturbed, a line of stone foundation rose 6 inches above the ground, the same cut limestone as the mill race fitted in the same style. The foundation formed a corner. She could see where a second wall line met the first at a right angle running west into the remaining mud. Beyond the foundation, lying on its side in the shallow water that still filled the lowest part of the cleared section, something enormous. She walked toward it before she understood what she was seeing. It was half buried in the mud at the edge of the stone channel, the mill race which ran through this section as Gideon's survey drawing had predicted. The object lay against the channel's eastern wall, partly submerged, its upper arc rising above the mudline. Wood, curved. The individual planks still present, still joined at their edges, darkened to the color of charcoal by however many decades they had spent sealed in the cold mud of the lower valley. A wheel, a water wheel. Half of it above mud, half still submerged, lying on its side, beside the channel that had once carried the water to turn it. Everett stood beside her without speaking. The hogs moved somewhere behind them in the remaining reeds. The heron, which had followed the cleared sections all season, stood 15 feet away in the shallow pool. Clara looked at the wheel. She looked at the stone foundation. She looked at the mill race, its stone lining running past the wheel position toward the intake at the creek. She thought about the survey drawing on her kitchen table. The 3 structures precisely located the engineer's hand-lettered notations, describing a water system that had powered an entire farming operation. She thought about the 1971 aerial photograph, the linear depression visible before the reeds grew tall enough to erase it. She thought about Raymond Stucks, standing at her fence 3 weeks ago, listing his remaining options. She called Gideon Marsh. He arrived in 40 minutes, which was faster than she expected, and told her he had been half ready for this call. He stood at the foundation corner and looked from the timbers to the wheel to the mill race with the expression of a man who has read about something all his life and is now standing inside it. He removed his hat, which was not a gesture she had ever seen him make before. "I don't believe it," he said quietly. Then, after a long moment, "The Bennett Mill properties I've documented in this county, every other site has been cleared, burned, built over. The stone removed for other construction." He looked at the wheel, the arc of its upper section above the mud. "The reeds buried this place before anyone thought to demolish it." Clara looked at the wheel. "So the Delwood Mill never disappeared." Gideon replaced his hat. "It was simply waiting," he said, "for someone patient enough to look for it the right way." The county preservation engineer, a careful man named Coates, who she had met twice before, arrived the following afternoon. He spent nearly an hour on the site before he came to stand beside Clara at the mill race. His expression was the particular one she had come to associate with people encountering something that exceeded their expectations, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of what they had expected to be surprised by. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "do you understand what this may be?" He looked back at the exposed wheel, the foundation, the 500 feet of stone channel running through the recovering wetland. This may be one of the best preserved 19th century mill sites remaining in this county, possibly in this region. He paused. The wheel alone intact in position beside the original race, I've not seen anything comparable. Clara kept her eyes on the mill race. The survey drawing shows two more structures. Coates looked at her. Where? She pointed northwest, into the remaining reed coverage. He looked at the reeds, then back at the wheel, then at the hogs working the last section of the paddock. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing the full scope of what was being uncovered. We're going to need to document everything before another inch of soil is disturbed, he said. Photographs, survey, structural assessment. He looked at the wheel one more time, the gray arc of it rising from the mud beside the stone channel, waiting for the same thing. The iris had been waiting for the same thing. The sedges had been waiting for the same thing. The herd's patient work had been uncovering one rhizome at a time since April. This changes things considerably, Mrs. Holt. She knew. She also knew that Stux had someone watching this property, which meant he would know about the wheel before the week was out. She had perhaps 10 days before whatever he was planning for the road easement challenge arrived in her mailbox. 10 days was not much time, but she had spent 40 years learning from a man who believed that the most important work happened before anyone else knew what you were doing. She had work to do. The notification from the bank arrived on a Monday. Clara was at the eastern fence line adjusting a gate latch when Everett came across the field with the envelope held at his side in the particular way of someone carrying news they have already read twice and still don't fully accept. She could tell from his walk, not fast, but deliberate, the stride of a man who has made a decision about his expression before delivering the words. She set down the pliers. The envelope was from Harlan County Savings, addressed to her by name. Inside, a single page on bank letterhead, formal language arranged in paragraphs that required 2 readings before their full meaning settled. Her agricultural operating loan, the one she had carried for 11 years, refinanced after Douglas died, to consolidate the equipment debt reliably current in every payment, had been purchased. Not assigned, purchased outright by an entity identified as Bluegrass Meridian Capital LLC, effective 30 days prior. The new holder was exercising its contractual right to call the full balance due. 60 days from the date of the letter. $43,800. Everett watched her read it. When she looked up, he said what they were both thinking. He bought the loan. She folded the letter along its original crease. Bluegrass Meridian Capital. That's not a company I know. I looked it up while I was walking over. Everett's jaw was set. Registered in Lexington. Filed 18 months ago. One listed manager. He paused. Raymond Stux. She put the letter in her jacket pocket beside the pliers. The morning was cold, late October now. The light thin, the field grass carrying frost at the edges that hadn't burned off yet. Around her, the recovered paddocks showed their full autumn character. The native sedges, tawny gold, the soft rush still green at the base. The blue flag iris gone dormant, but the ground where it had grown thick enough to hold its shape against the frost. 6 months of work made visible in every direction, and the letter in her pocket said it could all be taken in 43 days. Can we refinance somewhere else? Everett asked. Not in 43 days. Not with a title that has a live payment demand on it. She looked at the western section where the Commerce Park grading was still visible beyond the boundary. He knows that. Mom. Everett's voice had the quality it took when he was working up to something he thought she wouldn't want to hear. If we can't pay it, we lose the property. He forecloses through the loan acquires at the outstanding balance, and the whole thing goes to him for $43,000. I know what a loan call means, Everett. He was quiet. The frost on the grass caught the low sun at the angle it sometimes did in late October, turning the field briefly luminous before the light moved on. So what do we do? She did not answer immediately because the answer was forming rather than formed, and she had learned long ago that speaking a plan before it was complete was how plans came apart. She had been thinking about the emergency historic designation process for 3 weeks since the morning after Coates stood beside the mill race and called it one of the finest preserved sites in the region. She had been thinking about it while watching the hogs clear the last paddock, while helping Gideon document the wheel's dimensions, while listening to Coates describe what the structural assessment had revealed about the foundation courses. She had not told anyone she was thinking about it because thinking was not the same as doing, and she was not yet ready to do it. Now the timeline had been imposed from outside. 43 days. I need to go to the county assessor's office, she said, this afternoon. Everett looked at her. He had learned over the course of this year not to ask what she was doing before she was ready to say. "All right," he said. "I'll finish the gate." The Harlan County Assessor's Office occupied a corner of the courthouse building, 2 floors above the basement where the auction had taken place 7 months ago. Clara had been in it twice for records requests and once years ago for a property boundary clarification. The clerk on duty was a woman named Hargrove, who handled records with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that accuracy mattered more than speed in her particular work. Clara requested access to the property law reference file, specifically the Kentucky Heritage Land Conservation Statutes and the Administrative Code governing State Historic Preservation Office designation procedures. Hargrove brought the bound volumes without asking what they were for. Clara sat at the reference table for 2.5 hours. The Kentucky State Historic Preservation Office administered the designation process under guidelines that were more accessible than she had expected. Properties with documented historical significance could be nominated by landowners directly. No intermediary required, no county commission approval needed as a precondition. The nomination required a completed application form supporting documentation of historical significance, photographs, a site survey, or plat map locating the relevant structures, and a letter from a qualified historical professional attesting to the property's significance. The standard processing time was 90 to 120 days. She kept reading. There was a provision for emergency designation. Properties facing documented threat of irreversible alteration or destruction could apply for expedited review. The threshold for expedited processing was evidence of imminent action. Legal proceedings, demolition permits, active financial pressure combined with preliminary evidence of significance sufficient to warrant preservation. Emergency designation decisions could be rendered in 30 to 45 days. 43 days. She read the emergency provision 3 times. She copied the relevant statutes in longhand into her notebook, the specific language about qualifying threats, the documentation requirements, the contact information for the KSPO field office in Frankfurt. She sat with the notebook open for several minutes, looking at what she had written. A property owner could file the emergency nomination directly. No attorney required. No county approval required. The filing itself, once received by the KSPO, triggered a legal status that constrained certain actions against the property during the review period, specifically actions that could constitute irreversible alteration while a designation determination was pending. She closed the notebook. She thanked Hargrove and walked out of the assessor's office into the October afternoon. She did not tell Everett what she had found when she returned to the farm. She did not tell Gideon Marsh, who called that evening, about the structural engineer's timeline for the foundation assessment. She did not tell Warren DeLoy, who had left a message asking about the water quality readings she had promised for his ongoing documentation file. She thanked each of them and took the notes she needed and said goodnight. What she did instead was sit at the kitchen table with the survey drawing the 1971 aerial photograph. Every document Gideon had provided from the county archives. Every photograph she had taken since April. Coates's preliminary assessment notes. Warren DeLoy's official assessment report. Her daily rotation logs, the water testing records, the deed to the property. She arranged them by category. She read DeLoy's report again for the specific language he used to describe the ecological recovery. She reread Coates's notes for his characterization of the mill race's state of preservation. She reread Gideon's accompanying letter, which he had written 3 days after the wheel discovery, in response to a question she had sent him, asking him to put in writing what he had said standing at the foundation corner. Gideon's letter was 1 paragraph. It said in the measured language of a man who had spent 40 years choosing words with care. The Delwood Mill site, based on the preliminary evidence examined, represented a potentially significant example of 19th century water-powered industrial infrastructure, warranting formal evaluation of its historical significance at the state level, particularly given the apparent integrity of the mill race, lining the structural preservation of the water wheel, and the documented existence of 3 associated operational structures within a contiguous property boundary. She folded that letter and placed it on top of the stack. Then she pulled a fresh legal pad from the kitchen drawer and began writing the emergency nomination application by hand because her printer had been broken for 2 weeks. She wrote through the evening. She ate standing at the counter rather than stopping. Everett came in at 9, looked at the table, looked at her, said nothing, and went to bed, which was the most useful thing he could have done. She finished the first draft at 11:15. She read it twice, made corrections, wrote it clean on fresh pages. The application described the property, its history as documented in the county records, and the 1889 survey, drawing the physical evidence discovered during ecological restoration, the findings of the preliminary structural assessment, and the nature of the threatened action, a called loan from an entity controlled by the adjacent commercial developer. She attached the photocopied supporting documents in the order the KSPO guidelines specified. She attached Gideon's letter. She attached Coates's notes. She attached 12 photographs chosen for their documentation value, the stone mill race in 2 sections, the wheel in situ beside the channel, the foundation corner, the emerging native vegetation in the restored paddocks. At the bottom of the cover letter in the line, requesting the applicant's basis for expedited review, she wrote 3 sentences. She wrote them without consulting the statute again because she had the language memorized. She wrote them and underlined the phrase that mattered: documented imminent financial action by an adjacent commercial developer that would, if unchallenged, result in transfer of ownership and subsequent irreversible alteration of the site. She put everything in a large envelope, sealed it, wrote the KSPO Frankfurt address in full, placed it beside her keys so she would not leave without it in the morning. Then she turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. She drove to the post office in Harlan before 7 the next morning. Certified mail return receipt requested. The clerk weighed the envelope, affixed the postage, handed her the receipt with the tracking number. She put the receipt in her jacket pocket and drove out to the Delwood property. The Hogs were in the final section of the last paddock, and the reed coverage that remained was less than 2 acres now, a remnant stand in the northernmost corner that the animals had been systematically reducing for 10 days. The change to the property's overall character was so complete that she sometimes had to remind herself what it had looked like from the road in March. The wall of a gray-green that had closed off the entire parcel from view was gone. In its place, the land revealed itself in layers, the restored paddocks in the foreground dense with native growth, the mill race running its diagonal line through the middle section, its stone lining now fully exposed and documented across its entire 520-foot length, the water wheel lying in its position beside the channel, partly cleared of mud by Coates's team during their structural assessment work, the foundation courses of the main mill building rising a foot above the recovered ground, the corners precise, the stone as fitted as the day it was laid. She walked the mill race that morning from the creek intake to the wheel position. She had done this several times since the channel was fully exposed, always with a specific purpose: documentation, measurement, consultation with Coates or Gideon. This morning she walked it without purpose, which was a different kind of attention. The stone lining of the channel was remarkable in the way that things made to last. Sometimes are not dramatic, not obviously impressive, but carrying a quality of rightness in its proportions. Its engineering, the way the grade was maintained across terrain that was not naturally cooperative. Someone had understood this valley the way she had come to understand it, where the water came from, where it wanted to go, how to work with its direction rather than against it. She stood at the wheel position for a while. The mill race at this point was intact on both sides to full depth, the channel clear of the debris that had choked it. Coates had told her that cleaning the intake and removing the accumulated sediment from the main channel length might be sufficient to restore flow. Not because any pump or mechanical system was needed, because the grade differential that the original engineers had designed into the channel would do the work gravity had always been willing to do if the obstruction was removed. 11 feet of fall over 520 feet of channel. The water would move. She had not yet cleared the intake. She was waiting. She understood for the right moment, the moment when she knew whether she still owned the land. The notification from the KSPO came in the second week of November. It arrived as a phone call, first a field officer named Prater, whose voice carried the careful neutrality of a state agency professional, explaining that the application had been received, reviewed for completeness, escalated to the emergency designation track based on the evidence of imminent financial threat, assigned to a senior evaluator visited. She had not known about the visit, had not been present, but someone had been on the property with a camera and a measuring wheel while she was at the farm, and determined by the senior evaluator to meet the threshold for emergency historic designation under Kentucky statute. The formal designation letter will arrive by week's end, Prater said, but I'm calling to inform you that the designation is effective as of today's date, which is the date of the determination. The property is now listed on the Kentucky Register of Historic Places. A pause. Mrs. Holt, the evaluation team, described this as one of the more significant mill site discoveries they've reviewed in recent years. The integrity of the mill race lining alone is apparently exceptional. Clara was standing at the kitchen table. She sat down. "What does the designation mean for the outstanding loan?" she asked. "You'll want to confirm this with an attorney," Prater said. "But the statute is clear that a called loan cannot be used to compel sale of a designated historic property to a commercial entity whose proposed use would constitute irreversible alteration of the historic resource. The loan remains your obligation, you'll need to service it. But the mechanism that was being used to pressure force sale is constrained by the designation. The property cannot be transferred under those conditions without KSPO review and approval." She was quiet for a moment. "And the adjacent commercial development? A commercial development cannot be sited in direct adjacency to a designated historic property without a state compatibility review. The review process typically takes 6 to 12 months. Another pause. "We're aware of the Commerce Park application in the county planning record." She thanked Prater and set the phone down. She sat at the table for a long time without moving. The designation letter from the KSPO she already knew would carry the official language. But the phone call from Prater had carried the reality Stux's loan call was neutralized. The Commerce Park, as it was currently planned, was stalled indefinitely. The land was protected not by a court battle, not by an attorney, not by anyone stepping in on her behalf, but by the thing Stux had never thought to look for, because it had been buried under the reeds he had assumed were worthless. The history of the place had saved the place. The following morning, she drove to the property before anyone else arrived and walked to the mill race intake at the creek bank. The October rains had raised Harlan Creek 2 feet above its summer level, and the water was moving with the particular authority of a stream that has been recently fed. The intake structure, the stone-lined opening where the original channel diverged from the creek, was clear. Coates's team had cleaned it during their assessment. The channel itself had been cleared of sediment along its full length. Over the past 3 weeks, the accumulated debris of decades removed carefully by hand to avoid disturbing the stone lining. Clara stood at the intake for a long moment. Then she removed the temporary wooden boards that Coates had placed across the opening to prevent accidental flow during the assessment period. The water moved immediately. It entered the channel without noise, filling the lowest section first, then advancing up the grade in a steady progression. She walked beside it, watching it find the channel walls, the way it followed the stone lining the original engineers had shaped to direct it. The water did not rush. It moved with the unhurried confidence of something following instructions that had not changed in 150 years. Past the midpoint of the channel. Past the section where Gideon had found the first exposed stones in October. Past the marker flags Coates's team had placed at the documentation points. It reached the wheel position and ran past the wheel into the lower section of the channel, pooling in the cleared basin at the end of the race, before draining slowly back toward the creek through the natural low ground. The wheel itself was not yet functional. It required restoration work that Coates had estimated would take most of the following year. But the channel carrying water past its position, the stone walls directing the current exactly as they had been designed to, was something Clara stood beside for a long time without needing to name. She was still standing there when Everett arrived. He came down the path from the gate, stopped when he saw the water moving in the channel, looked at her. "You opened the intake." The designation came through. He looked at the water in the mill race. Then he looked at the wheel. Then he looked at the recovered paddock stretching back toward the road. He was quiet for a moment that carried its own kind of weight. "So it's done." "The designation is done," Clara said. "The mill isn't. Neither is the wetland." He nodded, understanding that she meant both of them would continue. The Hogs finished the last remnant section of reeds in the 3rd week of November, a stand in the northernmost corner that had been the densest on the property, the rhizomes there going down further than anywhere else, requiring 4 passes over 10 days before the ground was fully open. When the animals moved through the last of it and the final reed stems fell, Clara walked the cleared ground alone in the early morning. The entire 82 acres lay open for the first time since before she was born. What she saw was not what anyone standing at the road in March would have imagined seeing. The land had not become a field or a pasture or any of the things that cleared land conventionally becomes. It had become itself, the version of itself that existed before the drainage channels failed and the reeds arrived. Native sedges covered the wetland sections in the gold of late autumn. Rushes stood along the water margins. Willows that had survived somewhere in the reed mat, as suppressed seedlings for years, had grown 4 feet in the cleared light since spring, their branches trailing toward the open sky. The mill race ran its diagonal line through the center of it all, the water moving steadily from creek to wheel position, indifferent to how long it had been waiting for that channel to be opened. Gideon came out the following week with the graduate students from the university history department who had contacted him after the designation announcement. There were 3 of them, serious young people with clipboards, who photographed everything and measured everything and asked questions that went further back in time than Clara's knowledge extended. She answered what she could. When she couldn't, she directed them to the county archives and to Gideon. One of them, a young woman who wore her field notebook in her front pocket. The way some people wear a phone, asked Clara, a question that stopped her for a moment. "When did you first know there was a mill under there?" Clara considered this honestly. "I didn't. I knew there had been a mill. Whether anything survived, I didn't know that until your colleagues found the wheel." The student looked surprised. "You bought the property without knowing what would be here." "I knew water doesn't gather in a valley like this without a reason," Clara said. "People have always built beside reliable water. Whatever was built here, whether it survived or not, was worth knowing about." The student wrote something in her notebook. Clara watched her write it, thinking that the sentence sounded more certain than she had felt on the morning of the auction, the morning she drove home with the bidder's card in her pocket, not entirely sure what she had just done or whether it would amount to anything at all. What came next arrived in stages, the way most things do when they're going to last. The blacksmith shop foundation appeared in early December when Gideon organized a careful hand excavation of the northwestern section using the survey drawings coordinates. The hogs had cleared the surface vegetation, but the foundation itself was below the rooting depth, and it emerged under Gideon's methodical supervision over the course of a weekend. Stone walls, 3 courses visible above the excavated grade. The interior floor still carrying fragments of iron, a broken hammerhead, 3 horseshoes in various states of oxidation. What appeared to be part of a hinge assembly, the purpose of which no one could immediately determine, but which Gideon photographed from 6 angles before moving it. The forge itself was identifiable by the distinctive arrangement of its stone base, the flue opening in the north wall, the iron grate fragments still in place. Coates stood in the doorway of the excavated blacksmith shop, a gap in the foundation wall that was clearly the original entrance, and turned slowly to take in all 4 walls. "Nothing was destroyed," he said. "Everything was simply buried." He looked at Clara. "This doesn't happen. Properties like this, they get cleared. They get built over, they get stripped for materials. The stone alone from this site would have built 3 chimneys." He looked at the walls. "The reeds saved this." "The reeds buried it first," Clara said. "Yes." He looked at the forge base. "But they also kept everyone else out." The cast iron flywheel from the sawmill emerged 3 days later from the shallow sediment on the eastern side of the secondary race extension. It was intact, which struck Coates as nearly impossible, until he turned it over and found that the lower face had been resting on a limestone slab that had kept it elevated enough above the anaerobic mud to prevent the worst corrosion. Gideon dated it from its casting marks to approximately 1877, within the range of the mill's documented operational period. 3 structures, all present, all documented. The Delwood Mill had not disappeared. It had been waiting in the simplest possible way by staying exactly where it had always been, below the level at which anyone had thought to look. Warren Deloy returned in early spring of the following year when the wetland recovery had been running for 12 months. He walked the full property without stopping except to take notes, which he did frequently. By the time he reached the mill race, he had filled 6 pages. He stood at the water's edge looking at the stone channel with the expression of a man reconciling what he had expected with what he was observing. "I owe this land an apology," he said. Clara was standing beside him. "For what? When I did that first assessment, when I came out here thinking I was going to confirm a contamination complaint, I had already decided what this place was." He looked at the water moving in the channel. Non-recoverable wetland. Invasive monoculture. I had the county's 2 failed reclamation attempts in my file, and I thought I knew. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought restoring this would take decades, equipment, significant capital." He looked toward the hogs grazing at the paddock edge. "Turns out they work for grain." Everett, standing 10 feet away checking a fence connection, laughed. Clara looked at the herd. 40 of the original animals remained on the property in a maintenance rotation, moving through the paddocks in a schedule calibrated to prevent any new reed establishment from gaining root depth. Every few weeks, they would find a young Phragmite shoot pushing through the sedge mat and root it out before it could spread. The work had shifted from reclamation to stewardship, which was a different rhythm, but not a lighter one. The dedication ceremony for the Delwood Mill Preserve was held in October on the first anniversary of the waterwheel's discovery. The County Historical Society organized it. Gideon spoke. Coates spoke. A representative from the KSPO spoke about the emergency designation process and mentioned, without identifying her specifically in a way that required acknowledgement, that the nomination had been prepared and filed by the property owner without legal assistance, which was unusual. Stux did not attend. His Commerce Park application had been formally withdrawn from the county planning record in August, 6 months after the compatibility review process confirmed that the proposed development could not be cited as designed in adjacency to a designated historic property. The Bluegrass Meridian Capital loan had been restructured. She had refinanced it through a different institution once the designation was in place. At terms she could manage the crisis resolved not by rescue, but by the removal of the condition that had made it a crisis. The land was hers, the loan was hers, the debt was workable, the land was not going anywhere. A school group arrived during the ceremony. 30 children from an elementary school in Harlan, shepherded by 2 teachers who kept them in a loose cluster near the mill race. One boy, perhaps 8 years old, with the particular focused attention of a child who was genuinely curious rather than performing. Curiosity made his way to the front of the group and stood looking at the water wheel. Now partially restored by Coates's team, the upper arc of it raised back to its original position. The paddles rebuilt from period-appropriate lumber that still smelled of fresh-cut wood against the old stone channel. He looked at the wheel for a long time. Then he looked at Clara, who was standing nearby. "Did the pigs build the mill?" Clara looked at him. "No." "What did they do?" "They helped us find it." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "So they're treasure hunters." Clara looked at the herd grazing at the paddock edge, a dozen dark-bristled animals working steadily through the sedge mat with the unhurried focus that had not changed in 12 months. "They'd rather be called lunch hunters," she said. The boy laughed, which produced laughter from the children around him, which produced a different kind of laughter from the adults, the kind that comes when something is said simply and turns out to be more true than it first appeared. After the crowd dispersed after the school group left, and the Historical Society members gathered their materials, and the KSPO representative drove back toward Frankfurt, Coates came to stand beside Clara at the mill race. He had been quiet during most of the ceremony, the way he was quiet on the site. Observant, thinking, not filling silence that didn't need filling. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What?" He looked toward the exposed stonework, the foundation courses, the channel running its steady current past the wheel. If those reeds hadn't covered this place when the drainage channels failed, if the land had stayed accessible. He paused. The stone would have been taken for building materials. The timbers would have been salvaged. The wheel would have been broken down for scrap iron during one of the wars. He looked at her. The reeds buried this history. "They did," Clara said. "But they also kept it." He said it with the tone of a man who has been turning a thing over long enough to find its other side. 150 years of coverage and everything is still here. The evening settled across Harlan Creek in the particular way of October evenings in that valley, the light going gold, then amber, then the blue that comes before dark. The water in the mill race, catching each stage and carrying it a little distance before letting it go. The hogs moved in the near paddock, rooting in the methodical way they had rooted all year, finding whatever was beneath the surface, turning it up, moving on. They had done what they were built to do. They were still doing it. Clara walked the mill race one more time in the fading light from the creek intake to the wheel position. She had walked it often enough now that she did it without thinking about the path her feet found the line of the stone channel through the sedge mat without her directing them. At the wheel, she stopped. She had not expected to find a mill. She had not bought the land with a mill in mind, only with the knowledge that water gathers where the ground gives it reason, that people have always built beside water. They could trust that whatever had been built in this valley before the floods came deserved to be looked for. Whether anything survived was a question she had not been able to answer in March. She had simply believed it was worth asking. The water in the channel moved past the wheel in the last light, following instructions laid down by people who had understood this ground more than a century before she walked it. The stone walls held. The grade did its work. The current found its way through the valley the same way it had always found its way, not because anyone had built something new, but because someone had cleared away what covered the old. By the following spring, no one called it the Delwood Swamp anymore. They called it the Delwood Mill Preserve, which was the name on the KSPO designation. The name on the county historical marker. Gideon had spent 3 months arranging the name on the interpretive signage at the boardwalk entrance that allowed visitors to walk the mill race without disturbing the sedge mat. School children learned what the water wheel had once powered. Conservation groups studied the wetland recovery as a model for rotational hog management in invasive reed systems. Farmers came from 3 counties to stand at the fence and watch the herd work. Every spring, when the first phragmite shoots pushed through the restored ground, looking for their opening, the hogs found them before they could establish. The reed coverage that had swallowed this place for 3 decades was not coming back. The land that everyone at the auction had written off as a permanent liability had become, in the specific way that things become what they were always meant to be, something else entirely. Clara had never set out to prove anyone wrong. That had never been the point. The point was the land itself, what it held, what it could recover, what it had been keeping for anyone patient enough to look. When people called the mill discovery remarkable, she understood what they meant. But she had come to see the discovery differently than they did. The remarkable thing was not the wheel or the mill race, or the blacksmith shop with its intact forge. The remarkable thing was simpler, that the land had kept all of it. Through floods, through abandonment, through decades of invasive coverage that defeated every attempt to clear it through county assessments, that wrote it off as unrecoverable, the ground had held what it was given. It had not destroyed the history in its keeping. It had only covered it, which was, she had decided what land does when it's left to its own patience. It does not forget. It waits for someone willing to work with it instead of against it, someone who understands that what looks like failure sometimes looks that way only because the right question hasn't been asked yet. She had asked the right question on a March morning in a courthouse basement, when everyone in the room was laughing, when the auctioneer had run out of interest and the silence had grown heavy enough to matter. She had raised her card. The rest was the land's answer.